Welcome everyone. In the previous videos we have discussed about this glycolysis, we have even seen Krebs cycle, we have seen oxidative phosphorylation, then how this energy sheet. Now in this class we will see, here we know that there are different respiratory substrates. Respiratory substrates are the substrates which breaks down during the process of respiration by the addition of oxygen. When the oxygen is added, these respiratory substrates break down, giving rise to carbon dioxide and water. So here respiratory substrates help in respiration by breaking down into carbon dioxide and water by the usage of oxygen. This is all know. So we also know that respiratory substrates are of we have different types of respiratory substrates. Like we have carbohydrate is one type of respiratory substrate. Then we have proteins. It is also one type of respiratory substrate. Then fats are there. These carbohydrates, proteins, fats, organic acids, these are the examples of respiratory substrates. That is the substances which break down during respiration and help us in giving the energy. Now here respiratory substrates, major respiratory substrate which is used is carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is the major respiratory substrate which is used during respiration. It doesn't mean that proteins and fats are not utilized. Proteins and fats are also utilized during respiration. So we will see in this one at what cycle, that is at what way, which place in the cycle these respiratory substrates are joining. We have seen this glycolysis. Here in this glycolysis, what we have seen is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid. In glycolysis, we have seen this glucose is broken down through a series of 10 reactions into pyruvic acid. Glucose undergoing 10 reactions and it is producing pyruvic acid. So this happened in glucose, that is breakdown of glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. Now here in this process then the pyruvic acid enters into Krebs cycle. In the next step of respiration, the first step of respiration is glycolysis, in which glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid. Then the pyruvic acid enters into the next step of respiration, that is Krebs cycle. Here in this one, during this glycolysis, the carbohydrates are turned into simple sugars first. The carbohydrates are turned into simple sugars, that is the glucose, simplest form. The food which we eat, that is there are carbohydrates. The carbohydrates will be digested into glucose, the carbohydrates will be converted into glucose during digestion. Now after this digested food enters into the cell, in the cytoplasm, glucose starts the process of glycolysis. Wherein what happens? So the glucose will be changed to glucose 6-phosphate. I said you in glycolysis 10 reactions will take place. We won't be writing all the 10 reactions, but here that is few reactions will write it. So here this carbohydrates, when taken down by our body, that is as the food, that will be digested into simple sugars, that is glucose. This glucose along with the blood enters into the cell. In the cytoplasm of the cell, glucose breaks down into glucose 6-phosphate. Glucose changes, not breakdown, glucose changes to glucose 6-phosphate. This glucose 6-phosphate is further changed into an isomer fructose 6-phosphate. Then here fructose 6-phosphate will change to fructose 1,6-biphosphate. Then fructose 1,6-biphosphate, it changes into 2 compounds. Here till now it was a 6 carbon compound. So here also 6 carbon compound. 6 carbon compound. Now the 6 carbon compound is broken down into 2-3 carbon compounds. 2-3 carbon compounds. One naming dihydroxyphenoxyacetone, that is dihydroxyphenoxyacetone, and the other is glyceraldehyde. Both of them are 3 carbon compounds. Both of them are 3 carbon compounds, and they are isomers of each other. Glyceraldehyde can change to dihydroxyphenoxyacetone, and dihydroxyphenoxyacetone can change into glyceraldehyde. These are isomers, but for the further reaction to take place, this glyceraldehyde will be as it is, and this dihydroxyphenoxyacetone will change into glyceraldehyde. Glyceraldehyde will further undergo few reactions. Glyceraldehyde will further undergo few reactions, then it will change into the final product, that is pyruvic acid. 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. It is a 3 carbon compound. It is a 3 carbon compound. So this all happens during glycolysis. So carbohydrates, that is glucose, changes into 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. This pyruvic acid then reacts with this acetyl coenzyme A. A carbon dioxide is released. A molecule of carbon dioxide is released, and it changes into a 2 carbon compound, that is acetyl coenzyme A. This pyruvic acid, with the release of a carbon dioxide, it changes into a compound, that is acetyl coenzyme A. This acetyl coenzyme A further enters into Krebs cycle. The acetyl coenzyme A, which is a 2 carbon compound, this enters into Krebs cycle, and during this Krebs cycle we see what are the different events which takes place. Here this 2 carbon compound acetyl coenzyme A will be combining with this oxaloacetic acid, changing into citric acid, then isocitric acid. So cycle will be seen. So that is during this, that is acetyl coenzyme A enters into Krebs cycle by release of what? Carbon dioxide and water. At the end water is released, carbon dioxide is released, and water is formed. After Krebs cycle, carbon dioxide is released, and after this oxidative phosphorylation, that is water is, during this oxidative phosphorylation, water, not oxidative, here electron transport, during this electron transport, water is formed. So now this is about the aerobic, these are the steps of aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, that is in which carbohydrate is acting as the respiratory substrate. Carbohydrate, when carbohydrate is acting as the respiratory substrate, it changes to glucose, then after undergoing various reactions, it changes to pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid then changes into acetyl coenzyme A with the release of an carbon dioxide. Then this acetyl coenzyme A enters into Krebs cycle, thereby releasing carbon dioxide and water. So these are the total steps of aerobic respiration. This is what happens in aerobic respiration when carbohydrate is taken as the substrate. I said you respiratory substrate are of different types. Carbohydrates, proteins, fats, organic acids, these are all the examples of respiratory substrates. So all of them will be helping in respiration. We have seen the pathway in which this carbohydrate undergoes the respiratory process. This is the carbohydrates as the respiratory substrates, how they undergo the process of respiration. Now coming to the next respiratory substrate, that is proteins. Carbohydrate is one respiratory substrate, protein is also one respiratory substrate. So here carbohydrates are digested into simple glucose. Carbohydrates, after digestion, they are converted into glucose, whereas proteins, these are also one type of respiratory substrate. So we take the proteins in the form of food. Okay. When we take the proteins in the form of food, the proteins will be digested into our body and change into amino acids. Proteins are converted into amino acids. The simplest form of protein is amino acid, like simplest form of carbohydrate is glucose. So here the simplest form of proteins is amino acids, that is proteins are broken down into amino acids. So now these amino acids consist of a carboxyl group and amino group. So here proteins are nothing but substances, that is amino acids. Proteins are broken down into amino acids. Amino acids are nothing but it is a combination of carboxyl, that is carboxyl group will be there and amino group will be present in the amino acids. So after the proteins are converted to amino acids through enzymes called as proteases. So here this carbohydrates will be changed to glucose by amylase enzyme. Many enzymes are there. So here for carbohydrate, that is for conversion of carbohydrates to glucose, amylase will help. So here the proteins will change into amino acids with the help of a enzyme called as enzymes, that is proteases. So proteins are converted into amino acids. Then these amino acids, after undergoing the process of deamination. So what happens during this process? This amino acid loses this one amino acid, that is amino group. These amino acids loses amino group. Proteins are converted into amino acids, then with the deamination they lose one amino group, and they join this respiratory pathway at sometimes it joins at pyruvic acid, sometimes these amino acids join in this pathway at this acetyl coenzyme A, and sometimes they directly join into this Krebs cycle. So proteins will be changed into amino acids. After deamination changes into pyruvic acid, or they enter into this pathway. After this changes, these amino acids will join at pyruvic acid, or it will join at acetyl coenzyme A, or it will join directly in the Krebs cycle. So this is how the proteins are utilized during respiration. Carbohydrates are the major respiratory substrates. Carbohydrates are utilized during respiration. Along with carbohydrates, proteins are also utilized. How they are utilized? Proteins change to amino acid. Then amino acid after deamination will change into pyruvic acid, or it will change into acetyl coenzyme A, and then that acetyl coenzyme A will enter into the Krebs cycle. Acetyl coenzyme A will enter into the Krebs cycle and produces carbon dioxide and water. So proteins also produce carbon dioxide and water. Proteins also helps in respiration. Next, here another respiratory substrate, that is fats. Fats are also the respiratory substrates. Fats will be broken down, like carbohydrate is broken down into glucose, proteins are broken down into amino acids. These fats are also broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. So this glycerol will undergo a series of reactions and changes to dihydroxyphenoxyacetone. This will further change into this glycerol. After undergoing series of reaction, changes into dihydroxyphenoxyacetone. This dihydroxyphenoxyacetone changes into glyceraldehyde. Then this glyceraldehyde changes into pyruvic acid. Then it forms an acetyl coenzyme A. Then it will enter into Krebs cycle and produces carbon dioxide and water. Then coming to fatty acids. Fatty acids after beta oxidation, they will change into acetyl coenzyme A. Fatty acids after beta oxidation, they'll change into acetyl coenzyme A, then they enter into the Krebs cycle. So here carbohydrates changes to that is pyruvic acid, then to acetyl coenzyme A, then enters into Krebs cycle. This is how the respiration with carbohydrate as respiratory substrate. Proteins will change to amino acids. The amino acids will after deamination will change either into pyruvic acid or either into acetyl coenzyme A and enters into Krebs cycle. This fats, it will change into fatty acids and glycerol. This glycerol will change into dihydroxyphenoxyacetone and enters into this, will change into glyceraldehyde, then pyruvic acid, then acetyl coenzyme A, then enters into the Krebs cycle. So all three, that is carbohydrates, proteins and fats, all three respiratory substrate enters into Krebs cycle, but they enter into Krebs cycle at different stages. They enter into Krebs cycle at different stages. So this is how you see a interrelationship among this metabolic pathways, and these metabolic pathways are sometimes in this metabolic pathways, sometimes what happens, the bigger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules. The bigger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules. So we call it as catabolic pathway. Catabolic pathway, in which what happens is bigger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules. During respiration, two things happens, that is bigger molecules will change into smaller molecules and sometimes small molecules will change into bigger molecules. Small molecules will change into bigger molecules. So both these processes takes place. In respiration, that is small molecules are changing into bigger molecules and bigger molecules are changing into smaller molecules. Earlier it was considered that the respiration is only, in the respiration only bigger molecules are getting converted into smaller molecules. But we have seen this during the cycles, Krebs cycle and glycolysis and all, that it is not this just bigger molecules are changing into smaller molecules. We have also seen that smaller molecules are changing into bigger molecules. Small molecules combine to form bigger molecules. Here in this you just take an example. This acetyl coenzyme A, it combines with oxaloacetic acid. So what is happening? This is 2-carbon compound. Oxaloacetic acid is a 4-carbon compound. So this 2-carbon compound and 4-carbon compound, they two are combining and forming citric acid. That is small molecules are combining and forming big molecule, that is citric acid, which is a 6-carbon compound. Okay, and in this we have seen the 6-carbon compound is broken down into 3-carbon compound, that is bigger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules. So respiration involves both those processes, that is in some reactions bigger molecules are broken down into smaller molecules, and in some reactions smaller molecules are changed into bigger molecules. So this changing of bigger molecule to smaller molecule, this is the catabolic pathway. And here the small molecules will change into bigger molecules. We call it as anabolism. And here catabolism. Anabolism is nothing but changing of smaller molecules into bigger molecules. Formation of bigger molecules by the joining or the addition of smaller molecules is anabolism, and bigger molecules will break down to produce smaller molecules, that is catabolism. So in respiration, catabolism is also involved, catabolic pathways are involved, as well as anabolic pathways are involved. So here when we see both those anabolic and catabolic pathways, these two are called as amphibolic pathway. So it is respiration. In this respiration, amphibolic pathway is seen, where we see catabolism as well as anabolism. So in the next class we will see what is respiratory quotient, which will be the end of this lesson, respiration.